Thank you so much for being here. I am delighted to introduce Peter, who likes to drop E's out of things like Peter and centered, but we shall forgive him for that. Peter comes to us from London, where he is an assistant professor in human-computer interaction at King's College. He started off with dual bachelor's degrees in, get this, one in psychology/sociology and the other one in theoretical computer science.
Cool.
Cool indeed. So you will see how that comes through in his work. He then went on to do his PhD in Vienna at TU Wien with Geraldine Fitzpatrick, whom I'm also a fan of. And he established himself there as a leading Austrian scientist. And has gotten Best Paper Awards at CHI and CSCW. He is also, just to drop some more fancy names, Oxford University. He has a visiting position there in human-centered computing.
It's more like informally squatting.
Informally squatting, sure. UCL, which is University College London. He's got an honorary research fellow position in evidence-based practice. So all of these combined together, just to summarize, the reason that I really wanted Peter here to talk with us today, one of the things that I personally admire is how he does wonderful HCI scholarship and does a great job of actually getting it out into the real world, and his smart toys are a great example of that. So thank you so much, Peter, and welcome to Michigan. Take it away.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm not sure if I've managed to get this thing working. Have I?
Don't think so.
Despite all of my degrees, I can't deal with simple technology, right? But I can also just stand behind the lantern and do policy speech.
Maybe. That's maybe working.
Okay. Anyway, so what I want to talk about today is, let's say, an overview of the work that we've been doing for the last 5-6 years, part of my PhD and then postdoc, but also pointing to what I hope to be doing for another, let's say, 5 to 6 to 7, depending on what happens. As Gabby has said, I'm based in King's College London, which is kind of interesting because they're just about to start an HCI group, meaning I don't have senior people around me, which means that I essentially do work without adult supervision, and it's really fun. I also squat in Oxford because my wife's at Oxford as a postdoc, and I just couldn't bother to bring it to London. And the Anna Freud Center is a part of, is essentially, let's say, a relic of my postdoc work that was based there a little bit. So what I want to talk about is how we might be using technology to support prevention interventions, specifically around the context of mental health. And I really like this little diagram because it shows the scope of ways in which we can tackle mental health or try and support mental health of people. And most of the work that happens so far is kind of stuck in the treatment area for various good reasons. But there's actually much less work, especially if we're talking about HCI and technology involvement, around the promotion and universal prevention part. And if there's one thing that I hope to kind of convey to you is that I think there's a lot of really interesting things that could be done in this area, and that there's a really strong potential for technology to do good. And the nice thing about promotion and prevention is do good at scale. So before talking about broad research agendas and so on, I thought that I might start with a particular example that we've worked on. Also because it allows me to talk about little fluffy, weird-looking aliens and pretend it's research. And I'll be also then using it to just instantiate the research directions that we're taking and try and explain why we're excited about something as weird as this. So this smart toys part of the talk is based on 2 papers that, if you choose to look up and read, you'll get more details about that. One of them is CSCW, the other one's JMER is Journal of Medical Informatics Research Mental Health, part of that. And that work has essentially focused on emotion regulation, where emotion regulation is one of the most important protective factors that we know about right now. And it's interesting because the measures of emotion regulation at the age of 4, 5, early childhood tend to correlate with relatively important life outcomes at about the age of 18 to 25, like will you be in jail, what sort of education will you attain, and how healthy and wealthy you will be. And those correlations are as strong as the ones with IQ or family socioeconomic stats. And it's not just one study that's done it. I love to show this example, especially at CHI conferences, because it's the traditional HCI work where you follow 1,000 families from birth to the age of 32. And you keep on measuring them all the time, and you measure a lot about their demographics. And essentially this is the currently seminal study that shows the impact of self-control and emotion regulation specifically on all these kind of important life outcomes. And I won't go through these graphs, but the reason I want to show you these is because if the bottom lines are childhood self-control quintiles, then always this line is something like percentage of adults with adult criminal conviction. And you can see that those lines don't really plateau, but they're relatively linear outcomes. So what that means is it doesn't really matter who you're helping to improve emotion regulation for. It always gives them a little bit of boost, at least statistically on average. Now, that's a line of research that talks about emotions regulation is kind of important. There's another line of research that's maybe even more important that talks about, well, it's not something that we're born with and can't be changed, it's something that's malleable, and there's 30 years of research on how you would do it through population level programs or individual interventions. And there are some common assumptions in how these training models or program models work that seem to fall out from when those programs have been designed. And one of these is that to do this well, to do this at scale, you need an in-class didactic teaching, or in a therapist room didactic teaching, where an adult tells you something like I'm telling you now, and then you're expected to take that skill that you've developed or you've been taught about and then apply it in everyday settings. The other one is that it needs to be adult-led, so you can't take a 6-year-old, give them a book, say this is a really good self-help book, go and teach yourself to read it, and learn. There's the notion of you need to train a trainer who goes and trains a school trainer who goes and trains the teacher, and then the teacher ideally trains the parent, and the parent then trains the child. So you have a couple of steps, and fidelity tends to go down, and also you don't reach the parents who you need to reach potentially. So the implications of this are that there's limited scale, reach, and fidelity. As a lot of these programs have been designed in the 60s, and the psychological knowledge is really top-notch, but the mechanisms available for delivery were trained human in a video, if you were lucky with a video. And what this means is that we're stuck in this fundamental conceptual problem where we're trying to teach experiential skills, and I'll show you what I mean by this, in situations where you're not really trying to apply them. So let's talk about emotion regulation. And I love this analogy with biking because essentially it's the same thing. It's an experiential skill, it's a procedural skill that you need to do in the moment. And it seems super weird if you imagine it on biking, but it seems totally normal for emotion regulation. So the techniques are, well, you describe the theory of what it means to calm down, breathe, or to count to 10, in a situation that's a class-based situation. Then you ask kids to role play the scenario. Remember last time you were really angry or sad. Breathe or count to 10, or are you feeling better? And then you show them videos of kids who are really good at self-regulation, and then expect them to kind of learn that just by the observation. But understandably, what seems to be missing is this notion of getting the support that you need in the situations when you are actually angry, sad, or stressed, or anxious, whether that is in class, because just the teacher-to-student ratio is different, or whether it's in the playground, or worse, in the homes, because there's a big gap between school and the home, generally. So we thought, okay, that's great. What would happen if we start thinking about how can we turn that model upside down? So is there anything that we could do that would not be in a class, but be situated in the times when kids do experience emotions, and that would not rely on adults, because we know adults are terrible. They don't want to spend 4 hours of their weekend being taught about how not to be bad parents, and they just tend to not turn up. So we're kind of HCI people, so there's a royal we occasionally, and then there's a team we, but I'll just keep on we. We've done some basic contextual work where I've volunteered in a low-income community in Oxford for 6 months, kind of weekly coming into a little kids club, and we interviewed a bunch of parents about how they approach emotional regulation. We've done a bunch of reviews across developmental psychology, prevention science, psychiatry, and all of this work, and all of my work generally, is done with a big non-profit in the US that is called Committee for Children, who have been doing social emotional learning programs for about 40 years now, and they seem to be in about 35% of the schools. So they're a really widely deployed and used curriculum, and they have a bit of experience around how SEL gets taught in the traditional. So we've done the review together with those experts and a bunch of other people. We have done a multi-phase design process with children and adults, developed the first prototype for the children, and when I say developed, it means that Professor Catherine Isbister and her students, PhD students in Santa Cruz, have led much of that design work, and they've done a brilliant job. And then we've developed multiples for technology for deployment. So we've made a little toy first. When it seems to work well enough, we made about 7 to 8 of those, and then we've done some pilot work with them. So just to give you a sense of what it means, what are the current social practices that happen in homes? And this is coming from our interview data, but when you look into psychology or developmental psychology work, this is very common. It's not specific to Oxford. And the notion was that parents are expecting that children will calm down on their own, often away from other people. The implication is that emotions are like the weather, it can't really be controlled, it can be avoided, or you can distract yourself from it. So you see that for the parents as well. So if the parents annoy, either they suppress it, which is the best way to get externalizing or internalizing disorders in the end, or they just distract themselves and avoid. So we've used that context to think about what is it that we could design and build that would be available to kids in the moment when they're asked to go to their room and cry until they feel better, something that they could latch onto and essentially would provide them support in that moment and ideally build some competence over time. And we really wanted it child-led, and we wanted it with no actual kind of training associated with it. So I always like to say, we literally throw the toys at a child and say, this seems anxious, do you want to take it out? There are 2 pilot deployments. The first one was in the CSCW paper. The second one was in the Chamber Mental Health paper. They both are really replicating the results that we've seen. The difference is that for the first one, we just interviewed the children and we gave them a little photo and a probe, so we got some insight into what happened, but we didn't have access to parents for various structural reasons, such as the parents didn't want to talk to us and they generally despise outsiders to the community. And for the second one, we had actually access to parents. So my research assistant, Nikki Theofanopoulos, came to the houses of people, interviewed them for an hour, gave them the toy, went off, returned 4 days later to exchange the battery, and then returned another 4 days later to take the toy away, fight with the child who didn't want to give it back, and interview them again. So what do we know? These photos are essentially what the kids were taking themselves. We just gave them a camera and asked them to record what was happening. So we saw a lot of the toy is incorporated into everyday settings. It gets played with. It gets read stories to. It slept with, it's taken, and a lot of things happen with it. The fact that we made burgers with the toy was the most frightening part of my positive experience. Fortunately, it seems like Snuffy, or whatever name of that particular creature was, did not participate fully and just watched. Also, what we saw as a really strong theme is kids really made sure that the toy is safe, and kind of in various ways. But I think the Daddy, what do you mean we're moving in a car without the toy having a car seat on? Are you mad? This kind of interaction, not that they would have that sort of lesson. But I think it illustrates really well how kids thought about it and how they perceived it as a thing that has emotions and is kind of not really alive, but pretend alive. And these are the kinds of things that we've heard from the parents, where a lot of the parents, and I have a number here somewhere, it's certainly in the Chamber paper, all of these are from the second iteration where we actually did what the parents were saying. Again, the results are the same for the first one and the second one if you look at just kids. So you would hear parents talking about how the child incorporated it into their everyday routines, how it actually became a part of something that they're using to calm down, and that they were, the parents noticed it worked. We don't know if it did work, they at least told us that they noticed it did. The kids were saying the same thing, with slightly less words, which was nicer for people to transcribe. It made me calm just by lying on top of me, so, I didn't tell you what it does, sorry, I'm terrible. So the little toy, if we very quickly go back to this. The little toy essentially has it looks like a fluffy, as you could see, and has a bunch of sensors in it. The most important one is the vibration motor inside that has been tuned to generate vibrations that feel like heartbeat. You can't hear them, you can just feel them, or kids would put the toy next to their ear to feel it. So it was a very kind of tactile experience. And then it has a bunch of sensors that it uses to determine whether it's supposed to be anxious or non-anxious. The main one is a back strap, so from the top of the head to whatever tail is a stripe of conductive fabric that detects whether it's being touched or sat on or touched in any way, and that made it calmer. So if you were given the toy, initially the heartbeat would be very quick, very frantic, and then as you were calming it down, it would slowly reduce in speed, and then eventually it would start purring, and then it would fall asleep, which made it look like wordless. It was the end goal, so that the kids didn't feel like now they have to take care of it forever. Gyro, really important. So we've done it in a way where if you just pick it up as you would pick up a normal object, the toy got really scared. Because you had to really move slowly for it not to be scared, which seems to be really interesting because it changes the whole way how people behave to it. It has to be mindful interaction, and I'll tell you a bit more about what the theory about why it's supposed to calm kids down, how that looks. And then there was something about ears, which the toy hated and got more angry, and feet that it left. Good. So just those few very simple interactions seem to have these sorts of impacts on emotion regulation. They seem to have very strong impacts on engagement. So the kids tended to carry it around if they were allowed to, or came back to it right after school. And also, weirdly, parental acceptance. So all parents have said that they would be willing to keep the toy for longer and actually wanted it. A lot of the kids felt kind of sad about giving it up. We nearly stopped the study when a child has been crying for 20 minutes while the research assistant and the parent tried to persuade them to give up the toy. We had to change the narrative around it, so it was not like, it's anxious, we don't know where it's from, can you take care of it? It was about, oh, this seems lost, would you mind taking care of it for a week until its mommy gets back? And that seems to have framed the interaction. Yeah, but anyway, it seems like the parents were happy with it, the children were happy with it, and the log data have shown, this is active minutes per day. It's so small, but this is 100 minutes a day. So about here is where an hour of very intense interaction would be per day out of the 7-day long deployment. And then this is roughly when and how it's played with it. So the N is the number of minutes per each hour. So if this is an hour, you can see that here it might have been 25 minutes of active interaction in that hour. And you can see which days are weekends and which days are school days, because that's where the gaps are. So they played with it until the school, and then they played with it afterwards. And there's a bunch of things just to show you that I haven't chosen the one that's the only one that was nice. Okay, so finally the logic model. We built something fluffy and weird that vibrates. Why should that lead to emotion regulation? On the high level scale, there are 3 steps. One is that we've tried to design it in a way so that if a child holds it, or if an adult holds it, or a parent currently holds it, they will feel that they're coming back. And I'll tell you more about how that happens. The idea is that if we're able to achieve that interaction, people will be coming back for it, because it feels pleasant. It's not very nice to cry in the bed. If I get calm, it's a good thing. So you have that cycle that just goes around. And then through that repeated engagement, that's essentially a pull engagement where you interact with it willingly, there should be a 3 where you're building a confidence. Already the fact that you're able to reduce subclinical anxiety, the literature would suggest that in and of itself is really important. But if we're able to, for example, shift kids' mindsets from emotions are uncontrollable unless I do alcohol, drugs, or ideally both, to I can control my emotions, at this point I can do it with a toy, I might be able to teach myself other techniques to do this when I don't have the toy. That is where we're heading. The data that we have show that the loop on level 1 and level 2 actually seems to work, at least within 25 families and a bunch of schools that we've deployed to. What we're working on right now is the how do you measure and how do you actually strengthen the level 3? How do you build an intervention around that experience? That might be a little more cognitive, a little more social. That will lead to that competence development. The way how the level 1 works is that the design decisions have been quite specific or directly tied to quite fundamental psychology theories about how emotion regulation works. So if some of you know the James Cross's model from Stanford, there are 2 particular phases about attention deployment. Well, if I'm sad and I'm focusing on what's happening on me and I'm really sad, that's not getting me less sad. If I'm able to just essentially shift the attention from replaying the bad incident towards something else, that's one thing. The other thing is this very calm, mindful movement, repetitive interaction that's calming people down. Third one is the physicality of touch seems to have a really strong impact in the same way as animals help people calm down. And the fourth one, what did I miss? Oh yeah, the notion of I'm calming someone else down puts people automatically into, so the caring for someone else puts you into the mode where you're trying to calm down, but it's a slightly different process than if you're trying to calm yourself down. So all of those 4 together seem to be playing and leading to that loop. Okay, so what's the magical cutting-edge engineering that we've imbued into these little creatures? And I think this hashtag sums it up very well. It's essentially a 6-state machine, which is a linear single counter, where essentially if I hit it with a bat, I got 25 minus points. If I'm very nice to it and I don't kick it, and I touch its back, I'm getting 1 point per second. That's it. It's literally just, it moves along that counter. All of the effects, all of that emotion, all of that interaction is just brought in by the people, by their emotion projection, and the narrative that's done around it. So, which we found interesting. This is just here to say we have good data, but we don't actually know anything. So we know that it can be deployed with a bunch of people, and people generally like it. We know that the Oxford Counselling Deputy Hub generally likes it and is interested in introducing it into like Oxford counselling sessions if we can figure out a way of redoing it slightly. So there seems to be some sort of effects that could be quite general, but we don't really know what the long-term outcomes are we actually building competencies, or are we just providing little crutches? How do we turn that into an actual learning intervention? So the idea behind it is we're sending home this little Trojan horse that's helping kids calm down, but actually it might change the whole narrative around self-regulation in the family, because all of a sudden, instead of, go to your room and cry, it's like, this thing it's anxious and it needs your focus and support and being there for you. Maybe that we can play it off so that the parents and children start doing this, which would be ideal. And then, how do you actually scale that? Nice thing about working with a nonprofit that happens to be in 35% of US schools is that they occasionally choose to like something and then they support it, and they seem to like the smart toy. And they partnered with a small company in Providence, which is quite close, that's been doing little animatronic robots for healthcare. So this there was their first product they've done as part of their Northwestern Veterans, I think, which was a bear for kids with diabetes, helping them take control of the illness, if that makes sense. Make them understand what's happening, understand how they control sugar and so on. The other product they've done was a duck for kids with cancer. So apparently, it was supposedly every child in the US who's diagnosed with cancer would have gotten one of those ducks as part of a Aflac, which is a big insurance company, Aflac-funded effort to do this. So they've partnered together and kind of included us as well, not in the actual term sheets, but in terms of knowledge acquisition. And this is how the little alien looks now. So they're actually taking it to production. We're in the process where they're just about to start building a factory line in China to produce these. I have a bunch of them, like a bunch of the little prototypes, the first prototypes in Oxford. And in about a year, there should be 10,000 of those as the first batch that are being sent in. The interesting part is that as part of the agreement, we will also have a research unit. So instead of having something that has embedded electronics and very low price point, we will also have access to all the 3D prints, all the skins and so on, but in a way where you can put in Arduinos and fully control what's actually happening. So the idea is that we have something that can be deployed at scale, and you can do the prevention science. Does this actually change something when you do it in a 20-school cluster around the mass travel? But also we can then start thinking about what happens when you include Bluetooth and a bunch of IoT technologies into home. What's the next step for something like this? Some of the stuff that we're doing is we're sending it out to schools. So we've just been exploring what happens when you change the interaction from one-on-one in the home to one little unit per class. We've had the animals in 10 classrooms, I think, over anything between 3 weeks to 4 months. I think my research assistant's going to one of the schools to bring in the new toys that they... Oh, by the way, those toys were there, even though the teachers had to physically disembowel the toy every 3 days. Very, very weirdly pull out the battery, then charge it in a saucepan so it doesn't put the school on fire, and then kind of put it back. And they still kept on doing it for 2 to 3 months because the kids liked it. And now we're bringing in the new toys where we're saying, well, you just put in 3 AAA batteries every 3 months and you're kind of going. This was the kind of, I did choose this one because it's nice and succinct, but generally the kids seem to like it. I'm not sure if we're getting very strong mental health outcomes, but at least it seems like it's stable in the class, and now we can do co-design around what is it that we need to build on top of it so that it becomes a much more useful thing for the teacher, for example, to have conversation with. The strongest proponent of this was the school counselor, who was telling us how by having this in the room with the kids who come in for the counseling, it just changes the discussion and it allows them to have, talk about emotions in a slightly different way than actually gets the kids to calm down, which is N of 1, but if we can scale it to N of 300, it'll be kind of nice. And we've seen stuff like this where it's incorporated into the self-regulation stations, and the kids make it in little houses, and all sorts of things like that. Okay, so that's that, just to try and wrap up and go from the bottom back to the big picture. What makes that project interesting for me is that it's an interesting case study that could have impact in and of itself, but it's actually a case study for a much broader agenda that is around how do we do different kinds of prevention interventions? How do we use technology in these ways that allow you to fundamentally change the way how prevention interventions are thought about and how they're delivered and what they can do. One of the things is that emotion regulation is just one of many protective factors, where a lot of them are things that you could imagine being changed. They're not something you're born into. I can't really change whether you live in a poverty-ridden area with a lot of gangs, but we might be able to do something about your stress management techniques. As for emotion regulation, there's a bunch of research that shows that a lot of these protective factors are malleable. That's what the social emotional learning programs do. Emotion regulation is just a tiny sliver. It's like one lesson out of 30. And all of these programs are on that prevention promotion angle. So they're both trying to prevent people from going to reducing the likelihood of developing mental health illness, let's say, but also you're doing positive psychology in the sense that by building these competencies, you're actually making people feel better on average. It's valuable. There are training programs. A lot of schools already use them. This is from 2013. The growth of the field seems to be exponential. Part of the reason why I'm here is that there's the first ever convening of social emotional learning people, where the biggest kind of umbrella organization is in Seattle called Castle. If anyone's interested, I can certainly make introductions to CFC, which is the nonprofit that we work with, and they, because they're such a big player, know Castle quite well. So yeah, and essentially there's zero or very limited number of people from HCR technology that would be playing in this field in innovative ways. So the more people can come in, the better. Okay, so there's no technology used. The assumptions are very much the same. It's all about class-based models, and the challenges are very much the same. So it doesn't matter whether you're teaching conflict resolution or emotion regulation or social skills. It's always the same problem of, I'm going to teach you how to bike by. Let me show you the pictures. So the idea for me is that it might just not be a little smart toy. There's a big change that is happening, and there could be a big change in terms of how emotions can be built. I like to, for myself, I like to make this analogy to behavioral change and how it looked in 2005, which, as you'll see, is very similar to how I think SEL looks right now. So at that point, they had evidence-based behavioral change strategies, which have been around for forever. The challenges were that there was no ability to support people out of office visits, right? So you had to go to a doctor and they gave you a little booklet about how not to drink, and then you went out and you tried not to drink. And the notion there was all mobile devices all of a sudden allowed people to think about these interventions differently. You could provide situated reminders, you could provide triggers and kind of trickle interventions. And that has changed how behavioral change interventions are done, from something that looked like SEL now to the just-in-time adaptive personalized interventions that you get to see right. It also changed the methodology about how they can understand which interventions actually work in the moment, how do we personalize them, etc. And what I'd be claiming is that SEL is roughly in the same place right now, where we have all these curricula that we know that work if they're delivered. We can't really support people out of the act of delivering curricula. And it seems like the technology and these little embedded things that are starting to be situated in the environments could be a similar technology enabler, in the same way as you couldn't build a little smart toy 10 years ago because it would just cost so much money and would be really huge. The fact we can build it is, you buy a tiny Arduino board for £30 and it powers all of that, including all the sensors. I don't think we know what the research questions for HCI would be here, but I think the biggest one that I see is the notion of how do you design for situated competence and skill development. It's no, within SEL, it's not about giving reminders. You know, if someone's really angry, getting a bing, I can hear you're angry, do you want to calm down, is a great way of getting people even more angry. Same thing for if you're a parent and they tell you, well, you shouldn't yell at your child, you're like, great, but that's the only way I'd get them out of the door, so I'd like a different technique, please, before I can stop yelling. So it's more about, you don't know what the action is, yet you need to teach people the action before you can start giving reminders. And we don't know how to do this. There's a nice analogy in programming education where initially, at least as my parents have been telling me, you had to punch holes in cards and then you brought it somewhere and then they lost your cards, or 2 days later you got this lovely message that said nope, and you have to do it all again, and that was your debugging. And now when you're teaching programming, you have these really specific sandboxed environments where you're deliberately creating a situation for kids to look, well, people to learn to learn exactly that kind of function that you're able to do. So you're able to situate the learning into meaningful instances. Which works there. We don't really know how to do it with SEL because there the training situation is not a program where you need to put in 2 lines. It's like go and get someone angry and then try and resolve the conflict with them. It's about getting the training situations is harder. There's a bit of work that we've done that tried to poke into these sorts of things. There's a Tokai review that kind of kickstarted all the work that you've heard about that says there's SEL, there's technology, you guys don't talk to each other, you just slow might. And then there's a Kai paper from 2017 that talks about that uses reflective practicum from Schoen and talks about this being a really interesting theoretical model that could help people think about how these experiential competencies get developed. And the notion is, that's embedded in Schoen, is that you're trying to flip the learning model from something that's didactic to something that's experiential. And there's a bunch of examples of how that gets done. It's about empowering the learners to actively work with the experience that they're going through, because if you don't learn anything, people can't tell you. You need to experience and fix and have these little feedback cycles. And it's about embedding the learning into the real world situations where stuff actually happens. So in the same way as a designer learns by trying to solve a design problem, you learn self-regulation by trying to deal with not too intense emotion where it helps. Okay, so smart toys essentially are doing this. Exactly, it's about how do you take emotion regulation, make it situated, make it experiential, and make it something that you help people go through. The other projects, there are 2 other projects that I could talk about, and I see, so I've been so excited about all the slides, and I kept adding slides yesterday. So now I see I have 7 minutes. How much will you hate me if we go 5 minutes over the 45-minute line? Question? No? Okay. So there's one project, there's one person who's non-hater, so that's good enough for me. One of the projects that I wanted to talk about, and that's done with collaboration with Petr Slovak at UC Irvine and a bunch of other lovely people there, is looking at how we could use the existing violence prevention programs that have kindly been developed in the US for some reason in the 90s, especially in New York, with lovely outcome measures such as reduced number of stabbings in the backyard of the school. And how can we take it and essentially take the mechanisms and plug them into online spaces where kids are, where conflicts are, where it feels emotional, as you can see, and where, like, if any stabbing takes place, you just rejuvenate and you're kind of okay. So it seemed like a really interesting space where the emotions and interaction, the interpersonal interactions are real, but you have absolute control over communication channels. You have existing moderation practices that are terrible, by the way. But you could switch them to ones that are coming from prevention science. And maybe we could embed the learning into that online experience so well that kids don't even know that they're learning something. There's no formal lesson, but they're kind of picking up things along the way. So what we've done was we worked with a server that Katie Sellen and Yumi Ito are running in UC Irvine. We looked at I think this is based on 18 months of log data, which we subsampled across a bunch of time periods and looked at all conflicts that happened, and then we analyzed the moderation practices by the moderators based on this little framework from prevention science, where I'll show you what power means and so on. But for now, just remember that most of it is power and there's no problem solving. That's all you need to keep in mind now. So there's a Kai paper about this, where we're essentially saying the current moderation in that particular server, but generally it seems in a lot of asynchronous in a lot of synchronous multiplayer games, is that the moderators try to keep peace by preventing conflicts from happening, and then if the conflicts happen, they kind of swoop in, try to solve it, ban someone, build your house, and everything's good, just go on and play this, right? So there's no learning, it's just reducing the pain. And this is how it looks, right? This is an actual log data where someone called Justin apparently did something that wasn't nice and have been taken to prison, which was not called prison, but it was timeout or something, but it was essentially something where you couldn't do anything, and a moderator talked to you in a lovely and soothing way of saying, if you don't follow the rules, we're going to take action, you're unable to escape from here, we'll be leaving you, I can't let you out until you agree to stop breaking out of people's stuff. Justin obviously says, yeah, I won't. And the mod's like, well, okay, that was too easy, we'll keep you here anyway. And that's kind of the model, right? That's how it worked. And we thought, okay, that's not ideal. The prevention science tells us it's not ideal, and we've tried to build this training where we've taken the programs from schools, and instead of having kids come in for 12 weeks of in-person training, we gave them a 2-hour online tutorial, and then we've embedded a bunch of resources directly into the game so that the moderators could tap on these and use them in the moments where they were trying to solve something. And the biggest point was changing the mindset of people, of the moderators, from I'm here to resolve the problem for the kids, to I need to help kids to figure it out themselves. Then what we've done was we've looked at, I think, 178 different conflict instances, coded them line by line based on the different models of how a moderator can say, so the power is you're a bad boy, don't do that ever again. Suggestions, you shouldn't be destroying other people's stuff, it's not nice. Explanation is you shouldn't be destroying other people's stuff, it's not nice and they won't like you. And problem solving is, can you help me understand what happened here? How do you think the other person feels? What were you trying to achieve? Is that really where it was supposed to go? And the graph essentially says if you have power, the immediate response to power is about 8% of positive, which means the child is reflective or tries to resolve the conflict. There's a bunch of neutrals, which we deliberately took very large, and then there's a bunch of red, which is, I hate you, or something like this. The problem solving, which is where the prevention science is trying to go, is much better in that, and that is even though the moderators were fairly bad at it anyway. So just to give you a sense, this is the power model, and this is an actual script from the problem-solving model. And the assassin squid was the person who was in 45% of all conflicts on the server. So it's not a person who would be like one-off offender, but it's he or she was an interesting chap. And I love the start. What just happened in here? Ringo of 1940 is always a jerk to me and blaming all her problems on me, so I shot her, which is obviously what you do. And then the highlights are, instead of saying, this is not a good thing to do, the moderator asks, well, do you feel good right now? And in essence, like, no, I don't. Do you think the other person feels good? Did it solve the problem that you had? What else could you do? Oh, Ringo, I'm sorry I shot you. So, and that's kind of the type of interaction that you saw the moment the moderator swapped from power to something like this. There's a paper for Tokai preparation where we're combining all that data with where we've actually taken all this and embedded it into space where all the technical stuff gets taken out, and where essentially the kids self-moderate, and we're essentially taking out all the online technical stuff about if people have problems around stealing from other people, we make it technically impossible to steal. We're taking all of that off, but we're bringing in social norms, and it seems like over 40 sessions there were just 5 conflicts that had to be dealt with moderators. So it seems like that there is something there that could be effective. The question is, can we scale it? And if you're interested in a preprint, please let me know. We'll have something ready in about a week, I want to say, and we'll see how long that takes. And then, really quickly, the project that's taking up a bunch of my attention right now is thinking about how would you do the same magic of situating an intervention from something that's a workshop-based thing into what's actually happening, and do it instead of for conflict resolution or emotional regulation, do it for parenting interventions. And we're thinking about what would it mean to have parenting interventions situated with the help of IoT agents along the lines of Alexa, but not something that steals all your data and sends it to the cloud. And what would it mean? How would those interventions look like? What would it allow parents to do? How can we empower parents to learn from the situations that they're getting with their children every single time they're interacting with them, but don't really know what to do about it? How do we do that in ways that don't feel like you're being told you're a bad parent, but actually it's empowering you to deal with these situations that we want to deal with? And the nice thing about King's College London is their HCI is non-existent, but they have the strongest psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience. So there are 2 people who are top of the field, like top 15 on Google Scholar worldwide, in terms of ADHD and other kinds of parenting interventions that are interested in exploring how would they take the content that they already have and embed it into these sort of new ones. And it's done with personal data and privacy lab at Oxford, so there's a really nice technology layer to it, which is about how do you actually build these decentralized, privacy-preserving data collection networks in houses so that they're actually humane and ethical and are not Alexa and are not Google. Okay, so what I want to leave you with, is just a bunch of the points that I think drive a lot of this work. One is that just very little technology in SEL, but it seems like there could be a bit more. We seem to be quite well positioned to drive the innovation because we're kind of the magpie discipline anyway, so we're really good at picking up what other people know and then trying to change it completely so that it fits with users. At the moment, a lot of the prevention science is very medicalized, right? It's about adherence, and it's about do people do what we tell them to, and I think the HCI approach is, okay, how do we get people to actually want to do stuff so that they learn? What I think, it's an assumption, but I think the notion of how do you provide this situated skills development is quite close to biology, essentially. It's learning science, and in some ways, if you figure out the design patterns to do this for emotion regulation and parenting interventions, you've kind of figured it out for a lot of other things as well. The specifics of it will be different, but the theory behind it and the theory that drives the design principles might be similar. It's kind of a timely issue, so this is the number of papers of research results in Scholar Google for social emotional learning from 2000 to 2016. This is 0, and that's 2000 on top. And I've checked recently, it still continues nearly exponential. So there's a bit of a blow up of the field in a good way. And I think in the same way as technologies have brought very strong methodological and conceptual contributions to behavioral change in terms of how do we think about behavioral change and what is it that we'll do, we could do the same thing with prevention science. And with this, 5 minutes late, as promised, I thank you everyone for staying and listening. The royal we was a really royal we. There's so many other people that have contributed to various parts of the project. Cool. Thank you. And there's a bunch of papers. You
Oh.
yeah.
I was just curious whether you told the children that this toy is supposed to calm them down, and if yes, how did you control for that effect?
Oh, yeah, control for that effect. Right. So it was positive research, so we don't control for any effects.
So were they told that it's supposed to calm them down?
Let me see. Field notes. I think I can look up exactly what the wording is. It was positioned around emotion regulation. It was positioned about learning about calming down. It was not, this is an intervention for you because you're an idiot and you can't calm down. So it's somewhere in between those two extremes. Does that?
Yeah, thank you.
And the parents, when the parents were signing the consent sheets, there what we said was, this is a part of a research project that's trying to understand how we could build new interventions that help kids calm down, which is super important, by the way.
This is great, thank you. So when you're thinking about scaling up the interventions, like the puppies, or whatever you call
Yeah.
them, do you have a sense about how to evaluate that on a large scale?
Yes. So the moment you get to large scale, it becomes easy. Because assuming we know what the outcome measure is that we want to look at, and what we believe is, for example, emotion regulation mindsets is the first immediate one, or you could use any of the more traditional, like does it reduce the number of behavioral disorder kind of things. So the moment you're able to do this on large scale, you're essentially on the same playing field as all the interventions that happen right now. The goal is you ask for 2 million and you get a cost randomized trial across 40 schools, or half of the schools get the intervention and don't, and you do baseline post-op kind of thing. What we're about to do over the next 6 months to a year is do a smaller scale where within a class you're essentially doing a staggered deployment where you have about 5 points of data gathering for the whatever outcomes of interest you're looking at. And you do a baseline, then you do something about a month after where half of the class gets the choice to take home for 2 weeks or whatever dose is that you want. And then you have a switchover where the half of the class brings it back and the other half gets them to take. You do one additional measurement, when you do another measurement when the second half gets it, and then you do a follow-up. And what that gives you is essentially 2 lines, what you expect of the intervention works. The first group or the second group are the same on the baseline. The first group changes in the first 2 weeks. The second group doesn't, then the second group catches up, and then whatever happens in the follow-up. So you're able to quite quickly, if we had 45 units, we could essentially within 2-3 months get really well-powered trial to look at proof points, assuming that we're able to measure the outcome.
Do you need a control that's like a fluffy without the tech? Because the control of nothing.
I mean, we can happily add one. I am 99.9% certain that it's not going to do anything from all the calls of the group that we've done. Yes, we can essentially add on a non-interactive control, but in some ways, any single plush animal that a child already has at their home is that self-control in some ways. You could imagine. Yeah, well, it doesn't have colorful eels anymore, but it could be a narrative. But like what we saw was the first thing kids taught each other was how to turn it on. The only child that did not like the intervention was a child where the interactivity was mad, and anytime you moved it, it went straight back to anxious state. And the poor thing, people were telling us, the child lasted 3 days trying to keep that toy happy, and then just gave up and was said, "This is too much to me. It's like I can't do it." So it seems like the whole theory of change model is based on the emotion projection that is sustained by the interactivity, and the moment you take it out, just not going to be anything. We expect, right? But well, yeah, if someone's really ill, the moment I hand it over to clinical psychologists, they will have that extra control group and probably come up with these results. Does that make sense? Okay.
We'll talk about after.
Yeah, anyway, I know.
Have you explored the interaction with socioeconomic status, in particular how it affects dosage?
So we have N of 25 now, so the answer is no. But we've deliberately started looking at very low SES families. So the families that we've looked at the areas have been specifically chosen as being the lower fifth percentile on the index of deprivation in UK. So they have been essentially the low SES, as low as we could go. Not because we thought that that's the biggest market, we don't care about market, it's more about that's where we know the highest risk is. And in some ways, if we can make it work there, the assumption is we can make it work everywhere. But again, that's the interesting question. The moment we have 1,000 units and we can start doing big trials, that's, I think, what we will be looking at.
Go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
How did you choose the age group? Like, what is it? Because I didn't get that.
Oh, okay, so
And
yeah, I
then-
didn't say that. Which is, again, that. The age group was 6 to 10.
Oh.
And the point of that was we chose the age group where we thought, if we can't make it work here, we can't make it work anywhere. So 6 to 10 are the kids where they're no longer vegetables and they have agency. Like they don't live. I have a 4-year-old, right? So it breaks about that point. But it's, the idea was if we want something that's child-led, we need some level of competence, and there is a reason why kids start school at about 5, 6. And then you don't want to get into teenage years because the whole thing changes.
So they were still like believing the narrative at 8, 9, and 10 years old. That's my question.
Yeah, so what we heard from the schools was, well, what we saw from the data was, yes, they were still believing the narrative. What we heard from the schools was, even grade 5, which is like 11 or 12, they still loved it. And they were doing this interesting dance of, we kind of really like pretending it's real, but we know it's not. And yeah, we need to explore that more. But the teacher was quite interested in that, and the fact that boys of that age kept it in a scarf whilst writing because it suited them. And then if someone else needed it, they like kind of passed it on. and the whole class was okay with it. They had some sort of rota, informal rota of who gets to use it and when, apparently. Yeah.
Fascinating. Did you control for diagnoses by chance? Because
Oh,
we know
we-
that certain kids with certain disorders have even poor emotional regulation.
Yeah, so the point was we were desperately trying to get non-clinical.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Completely, right? So
Yeah.
it's prevention science, it's supposed to
Okay.
work for anyone and everyone. We're looking at low income, so that you might have a bigger chance of hitting something. But the point was, the child can't be clinically diagnosed. A, because the ethics end up being a nightmare.
Right.
B,
Right.
because we don't have one. Here, if it doesn't work and the toy dies in the
Then
middle
we
of the
do.
deployment,
Right.
it's okay, it's a lovely child, it'll survive. If you have someone with depression or anxiety, it's like I killed it and you scarred for life. That said, another professor from King's who's doing anorexia disorders was suggesting that she believes this would work really well for her population because they already have fluffies and they need emotional regulation. So it seems like we might be migrating towards clinical populations, but only now that the toy seems to have been kind of working and functional, and I think the migration will be about how do you embed it into therapy rather than how do you throw it at a child with a 10-second statement.
I think there's lots of room for embedding it in therapy.
Yeah.
With a lot of different populations.
I'm kind of excited
Yeah,
about
me
it
too.
because
Yeah. Yeah.
don't put me on low papers.